If you can't use arpeggios in your bass lines, then there's something you need to try. It's not complex theory or learning more shapes. It's a really simple concept, and once it clicks, you can use it to make really melodic bass lines in almost any style. Now, this concept is so powerful, it created a standout bass line on an album that sold millions of copies worldwide. And the first step to mastering it is actually understanding why so many bassists struggle with using arpeggios in the first place. So imagine you want to learn a new language like French, and to learn, you've got two options. Option 1 is memorizing every single word in the French dictionary, and option 2 is just going to France and speaking with native speakers. Now, you probably already know that the best option is option 2, because when you speak with native speakers, you don't just learn words, you study how those exact same words are used by better speakers to communicate. Now, why does this matter? Well, because this is exactly where so many bass players struggle with using arpeggios. It's something I see all the time. I actually talked about it in my free email series, 30 Days to Gig Level Bass Playing. It's also one of the most common issues I see with my one-to-one coaching students. Both of those are linked below in the description, by the way, and they're both really good. So go and check them out and then come back here for the rest of this. Now, the core problem here is that most bass players only ever end up learning arpeggio shapes, and as such, when they try and use them, they sound like this. Not wrong, but certainly not all that melodic and musical either. Now, don't get me wrong, you do need to know arpeggio shapes, they're very important. But where most bass players get wrong is they get taught that using arpeggios well is just about learning the shapes. And if they don't sound good after learning those shapes, then they just need to go back and learn them better. This simply isn't true. Learning more and more arpeggio shapes doesn't teach you a single thing about how to use them and apply them in the real world. In fact, it's exactly like reading the dictionary in our language analogy. If you want to speak the language on its own, it's simply not enough. So if you're struggling with this problem, it's not because you lack talent or because you lack skill. It's because you've only been studying the vocabulary without also studying how to use it. In other words, you're only doing half the work. But the good news is, once you start learning how to use arpeggios by studying how great bass players use them, then everything changes. And that is exactly what we're going to look at next. So we're going to learn this in two parts. In a moment, I'm going to show you how to turn arpeggios into really melodic bass lines. But before we do that, there's actually a bigger issue we need to deal with. The moment you start using arpeggios in your playing, you're not just adding notes, you're also adding rhythm, because those notes have got to go somewhere. And this is where most bass players start overplaying and run into trouble. So how do you add more notes and more rhythmic information without ruining the song? There's a very simple answer to this, and the best way to understand it is by studying a bass line that nailed these two concepts on an album that sold millions of copies worldwide. So the song we're going to look at is Between the Lines by Sarah Bareilles. Now, I'm not sure if the bass line was written by her or by the bassist on the track, Chaney, but the important thing to note here is that this is a masterclass in how to use arpeggios really musically in bass playing. And to see how, let's go back to our language analogy for a minute. Imagine how awful it would be if every time you had a conversation in French, you had to use every single word that you knew. Every single conversation would drag on for absolutely ages, and it would be suffocated because there's just way too much vocabulary being used. Now, we all know that great speakers aren't like that. They don't just speak or use words because they can. Instead, they judge when to speak, when to add words, and when to just stay out of the way. What they're thinking about is the impact that they will have on a conversation. And it's this same idea of judging one's impact that is crucial to understanding how this bass line uses arpeggios so well. So if we start by listening through to the verse, we can hear that Chris doesn't jump into just using arpeggios right away.
My memory is cruel, queen of attention to details, defending intentions if he fails. Until
he mostly just sticks to root notes. Now, he's not trying to avoid arpeggios because he can't use them. He's avoiding them because at this point in the song, they would distract from the vocal and from the lyric and from letting the listener really settle into the song. Just like in a good conversation, putting them in now would suffocate the music with too much vocabulary. But all of that changes as we move towards the chorus. At this point, Chris knows the music is heading into a strong chorus and that it needs to build momentum to get there. So he uses some arpeggio vocabulary to build a transition that gets the song into the chorus and creates a really impactful moment by doing this.
That I could have sworn I'd heard him say it 10,000 times. Oh, if only I had been listening.
And it's that decision, that judgment, that enables him to add more notes and more rhythmic information without sounding like he's overplaying. But that still leaves one problem. Using arpeggios to create transitions like this is great, but it only shows us how to use them in really short bursts. It's a lot more like trying to use them to make a fill. So what do you do when you want to use them to turn ideas into longer, more melodic bass lines? To answer that, we need to look at what Chris does in the chorus, and we need to revisit our language analogy one last time. When the best speakers of any language talk, they don't always rigidly stick to what we might call dictionary correct words. They will often adapt them slightly so that these words can be more descriptive. For example, instead of using the technically correct name for this color, which is viridian, some might describe it by saying, oh, it's kind of bluey greenish. Now, technically, bluey or greenish aren't real words, but the thing to understand is that's not how great speakers actually see them. They view words as starting points that they can adapt to get their ideas across. But what's all this got to do with bass playing and using arpeggios? Well, it's actually this idea of adaptation that holds the key to using arpeggios well. Let me show you how. The chorus bass line starts with what we might describe as a technically correct F-sharp major arpeggio. But here's the thing, if Chris stuck with this pattern and just applied it to every single chord, it would be technically correct, but it would be much more predictable and much less expressive. It's not wrong, but it doesn't sound very musical or very expressive, and Chris recognizes this. So when the harmony shifts to B major, he changes his approach. What he's playing here isn't a straight arpeggio. He's inserting a C sharp between the root and third of that B major arpeggio. The important thing here is not to try and think necessarily in terms of theory, it's to try and think in terms of sound and emotion and musical color. In that sense, he's no longer playing a straight B major arpeggio. He's playing something that is B major-ish. It does still outline the harmony, but all of a sudden it feels way less mechanical. It sounds more musical, and it has a much softer quality which really fits in well with the rest of the track. He also uses the last note of these arpeggio ideas as a launching point for small fills, which helps to further disguise the overly theoretical sound the line might take on in the hands of a less skilled player. And all of this really helps the line breathe and become memorable. So here's the real takeaway. The way to use arpeggios in your bass playing and make them sound musical isn't to play them perfectly. It's to treat them as a starting point instead of a finished product, as things that you can adapt and soften and use to connect different ideas. A great way to practice this is to play through the arpeggios of a song that you know well, but whilst you're doing it, you want to experiment with connecting arpeggio notes with scale notes in between them to disguise the sound by slightly altering some of the notes, by using an arpeggio as a springboard to put fills in, or using arpeggios to build new ideas and transition into new sections. And after you've done all this, if an arpeggio still isn't adding anything to a song, don't be afraid to leave it out altogether. Just because you know them, it doesn't mean you have to use them. Sometimes they just work better in a different song. But now you've got a new problem. If all you're doing between playing these arpeggios is religiously sticking to root notes, your playing is never really going to sound that expressive and spontaneous, and it will always be a little bit too safe. Now, using more than just root notes and making it sound good is one of the hardest things a bass player can do. So in this next video, I show you one concept that will help you get away from just playing root notes, and this concept is so powerful that it created a standout moment on one of the most iconic albums of all time. It's the next dot you need to connect, so click up here to watch that video next.